The world didn't end with a bang. There was no single moment where everything stopped, no catastrophic explosion, no asteroid splitting the sky in two. It ended the way a candle burns out. Slowly at first, then all at once. And by the time anyone realised what was happening, by the time the news anchors stopped pretending it was under control and the military checkpoints went silent one by one, it was already too late. The wildfire virus had already won. But to understand how it won, you have to go back. Back before the abandoned highways and the overgrown cities. Back before the walls and the weapons and the desperate scramble for canned goods and ammunition. Back to a world where people still went to work in the morning and came home to their families at night. Where the biggest worry on a Tuesday afternoon might have been traffic, or a report due by Friday, or whether you remembered to pick up milk on the way home. That world feels impossibly distant now, like a dream you had as a child that you can only half remember, but it was real. Every part of it. The grocery stores fully stocked with fresh produce under fluorescent lights. The schools with children running through hallways between classes. The hospitals where doctors saved lives instead of ending them. All of it real. All of it gone. And the cruelest part is how quickly it vanished. The wildfire virus was first identified by the Centers for Disease Control on April 16, 2010. It was classified internally as wildfire MSB 3417, and for a few weeks, it existed only as a data point in a government database. A curiosity, something the scientists at the CDC could study behind sealed laboratory doors, while the rest of the world continued as if nothing had changed. Because for most people, nothing had. The virus was invisible. It spread through the air like pollen, like dust, like the faintest shift in a breeze you wouldn't even notice on your skin. And it infected almost everyone it touched. The thing about wildfire, the thing that made it unlike any pathogen humanity had ever encountered, was that it didn't make you sick. Not right away. Not in any way you could detect. You could carry the virus for months, maybe years, and never once show a symptom. Never cough, never run a fever, never feel anything at all. The virus simply settled into your body like a tenant moving into a vacant apartment, quiet and patient and utterly invisible. And it waited for you to die. Because death was the trigger. Not a bite, not a scratch, not contact with infected blood. Though all of those things could accelerate the process. The fundamental, terrifying truth about wildfire was that it didn't need the dead to spread. It was already inside the living. Every single person walking the streets of every city on every continent was already carrying the thing that would eventually consume them. They just didn't know it yet. The origin of wildfire has been pieced together over the years, mostly through fragments, scraps of information recovered from abandoned laboratories, broken radio transmissions, and the testimony of the very few scientists who survived long enough to tell the story. What we know is this: the virus originated in France at a biomedical facility known as La Biomedicine, sometimes referred to as DDMI. A team of researchers there, called the Primrose Team, had been working on something. The exact nature of their research remains unclear. Some accounts suggest it was experimental. Others suggest it was something more deliberate, something that was never meant to leave the confines of a laboratory. But it did leave. Whether through accident or oversight, or something no one is willing to admit, the wildfire virus escaped its cage. And once it was out, there was no putting it back. The Primrose Team, perhaps sensing what was about to happen, travelled to a conference in Toledo, Ohio in early 2010. They may have been trying to warn people, they may have been trying to help, or they may have simply been trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the thing they had created. Whatever their reasons, their departure left the remaining scientists at DDMI scrambling. The French government, in those early days, made a choice that says everything about how the world responded to wildfire. Rather than prioritising its people, rather than evacuating cities or stockpiling medicine, the government prioritized its art. The Mona Lisa was secured, the Louvre was protected, and the people were left to fend for themselves. For 4 months after the CDC identified wildfire, life continued in something resembling normalcy. There were reports, scattered and easy to dismiss, of isolated incidents, a man in a rural hospital who died on the operating table and then sat back up, a woman in a care home whose body was found walking the hallways 3 hours after she was pronounced dead. News outlets picked up a few of these stories and ran them as curiosities, the kind of segment that airs at the end of a broadcast with a raised eyebrow and a half smile from the anchor. Reports of a virus that caused aggression and cannibalism. Reports of dead people coming back to life. Most civilians dismissed them as sensationalist nonsense. Then August came. On August 25, 2010, the CDC declared the wildfire virus a global pandemic. 2 days later, on August 27th, the standard mortality rate began to reanimate and attack the living on a scale that could no longer be ignored or explained away. People were dying, and then they were standing back up, and then they were killing the people around them. And those people were dying and standing back up too. The cascade was exponential, and it happened so fast that by the time any government could mount a coherent response, there was no government left to respond. The military tried. You have to give them that. Soldiers were deployed to hospitals and schools and government buildings. Evacuation orders were issued. Quarantine zones were established. But the military was fighting an enemy that didn't follow any rules they understood. You could shoot a man in the chest 6 times, and he would keep walking toward you. You could set up a perimeter around a hospital, and the threat would emerge from inside, from the patients you were trying to protect. The rules of engagement meant nothing when the enemy was already behind your lines, already inside the building, already wearing the face of someone's mother or father or child. In King County, Georgia, a sheriff's deputy named Rick Grimes was lying in a hospital bed. He had been shot in the line of duty, and the bullet had put him into a coma. While Rick slept, the world he knew was dismantled piece by piece. His partner, Shane Walsh, tried to get him out. Shane came to the hospital as the military was executing patients who showed signs of infection and evacuating the staff who could still walk. He pressed his ear to Rick's chest and heard a heartbeat, faint but steady, and he faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He couldn't move Rick. The hallways were filling with the dead and the dying, and the soldiers who were losing control of both. Shane barricaded the door to Rick's room and left. He told Rick's wife, Lori, that her husband was dead, and then he led Lori and their son Carl away from the city toward a camp on the outskirts of Atlanta, where a handful of survivors were trying to figure out what came next. Rick would wake up weeks later, alone, in a hospital that had become a tomb. The hallways dark, the emergency power long since failed, bodies stacked in the corridors and piled in the loading bay out back. He stumbled through the building in a hospital gown, lighting matches to see, gagging on the stench of decay. When he finally pushed through the exit doors and stepped into the sunlight, what he saw was a world he couldn't process. Hundreds of bodies wrapped in sheets, arranged in rows under the open sky. Military vehicles abandoned. A helicopter sitting motionless on the ground, its rotors still. He walked home. The streets were empty. His house was deserted, the front door hanging open. He sat on his front steps and called out for Lori and Carl, and the silence that answered him was the loneliest sound in the world. That silence was the new reality. Not just for Rick, but for everyone who survived those first weeks. The silence of cities that had housed millions of people and now housed only the dead. The silence of highways clogged with cars that would never move again. The silence of schools and churches and shopping malls and all the places where human beings had once gathered and laughed and argued and lived. Now empty, except for the shuffling. Groaning remnants of the people who used to fill them. The collapse happened in roughly 2 weeks, 14 days between pandemic declaration and total societal breakdown. That's how fragile everything was. All the systems, all the infrastructure, all the carefully constructed mechanisms of modern life dismantled in the time it takes most people to finish a vacation. Power grids failed, water treatment plants went offline, communication networks went dark one by one. First the cell towers, then the landlines, then the radio stations. The last broadcast anyone remembers hearing was the emergency signal on loop, repeating the same instructions to seek shelter and await further guidance long after there was no one left to provide it. Dr. Edwin Jenner, a virologist at the CDC in Atlanta, was one of the last scientists still working when the lights went out. He had been studying wildfire since its discovery, documenting his findings in video logs addressed to no one in particular. By day 194 of the outbreak, Jenner was alone. Every other researcher had either fled, died, or taken their own life. His wife, Dr. Candace Jenner, had been one of the leading minds in the fight against wildfire. When she was bitten during the fall of Atlanta, she made a choice that was equal parts selfless and devastating. She allowed her infection and reanimation to be documented for science. Edwin recorded every stage: the fever, the delirium, the moment her brain activity flatlined, and then 2 hours, 1 minute, and 7 seconds later, the moment a faint glow returned to her brainstem on the monitor. Not Candace, not anything close to Candace, just the virus wearing her body, restarting the most primitive parts of her brain so it could stand and walk and feed and spread. Edwin shot his wife in the head. He collected her brain samples. He labelled them Test Subject 19. And then he continued working, alone in a building that was slowly running out of fuel, trying to understand a virus that had already beaten him. He had been in contact with the French scientists, the ones at the facility where it all began. They were the last people he spoke to before losing communication entirely. France, the birthplace of wildfire, had been working to find a cure, but their efforts had gone sideways. Instead of neutralizing the virus, their attempts to mutate it into something less lethal had created something worse. New strains, deadlier variants, walkers that were faster, more aggressive, more aware. The cure had become the disease, amplified. When Rick Grimes and his group of survivors finally reached the CDC, drawn there by the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was still working on a solution, they found Jenner alone in a building with a countdown clock on the wall. The building's fuel reserves were almost empty, and when they reached zero, the facility's automated decontamination protocol would engage. High-impulse thermobaric explosives, designed to incinerate every pathogen stored within the lab, from weaponized smallpox to experimental Ebola strains, would detonate. The entire building would be consumed in a fireball hot enough to incinerate everything inside in less than a second. Jenner didn't try to stop it. He had made his peace. He told the survivors that their deaths would be painless, that it would be faster than whatever was waiting for them outside. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. The world outside those doors was a nightmare that would last for years, maybe decades, maybe forever. But Rick wasn't ready to accept that. None of them were, and so they fought their way out, through the reinforced doors and the security locks and the ticking clock, and they escaped into the Georgia heat, just as the CDC erupted behind them in a column of fire that could be seen for miles. But Jenner, in those final moments, leaned close to Rick and whispered something. Something that would change everything. Something Rick wouldn't reveal to the group for months, because the weight of it was too much to carry. Everyone is already infected. Every single person alive on the planet was already carrying the wildfire virus. It didn't matter if you avoided every walker, if you never got bitten, if you lived behind the tallest walls with the deepest moat. When you died, however you died, you would come back. The virus had already won the only battle that mattered. It was inside everyone, and it was patient enough to wait. That was the truth that Rick carried with him, as he led his group away from the burning CDC and into the unknown. The truth that the enemy wasn't just out there, shambling through the streets and clawing at the fences. The enemy was inside them, inside all of them, waiting for the only thing it needed: time. To understand what the wildfire virus did to the world, you first have to understand what it did to a single human body. Because the virus didn't operate on a grand scale, not really. It operated one person at a time, one brain at a time, one death at a time. And it was the accumulation of those individual horrors, multiplied by billions, that brought civilization to its knees. The process began in silence. Wildfire entered the body through the air, through the lungs, through the simple act of breathing. It travelled through the bloodstream and settled into the tissues with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Because it did. The virus had no interest in killing its host, not yet. A living host was useful. A living host could walk and breathe and carry the pathogen to new places, new people, new lungs. The virus wanted its hosts alive for as long as possible. It was the most patient parasite ever to exist. But when death came, whether by accident or illness or violence, or simply the quiet surrender of old age, the virus activated. It targeted the brainstem, the most ancient and primitive part of the human brain, the part that controlled breathing, heartbeat, basic motor function. The virus flooded this region with activity, restarting just enough of the neural architecture to get the body moving again. Not thinking, not feeling, not remembering, just moving. The higher brain functions, everything that made a person who they were, their memories, their personality, their capacity for love and language and laughter, all of that was gone, extinguished the moment the heart stopped. What came back was something else entirely, a vessel, a carrier, a thing that wore a human face but had nothing human left inside it. Dr. Jenner's brain scans of test subject 19 showed this in devastating clarity. The initial scan displayed a healthy human brain, synapses firing in complex patterns, the electrochemical signature of a living, thinking person. Then the infection progressed. The synapses began to hemorrhage, flickering and dying like lights going out across a city during a blackout. Within hours, the entire brain went dark. Total cessation, clinical death. And then, after a gap that lasted 2 hours and 1 minute and 7 seconds, a faint glow returned. Not across the whole brain, not even close, just the brainstem. A dull, cold light in the deepest, most primitive corner of the skull. Enough to stand, enough to walk, enough to bite. The reanimation time varied wildly. In some cases, it happened in as little as 3 minutes. In others, it took up to 8 hours. Violent deaths tended to produce faster reanimation, possibly because of the adrenaline still coursing through the system, though no one ever had the luxury of studying this under controlled conditions for very long. Factors like age, body mass, and the circumstances of death all seemed to play a role, but the data was always incomplete. Always gathered under the worst possible conditions, always secondary to the more pressing concern of not being eaten alive. Secondary infection was a different matter entirely. A bite from a walker, or a deep scratch, or exposure to infected bodily fluids through an open wound introduced the active agent of the virus directly into the bloodstream. This wasn't the quiet, dormant version that everyone already carried. This was the weaponized form. It attacked the body with terrifying speed, causing fever, delirium, chills, nausea, and eventually complete organ failure. Death from a walker bite typically came within 48 hours, though it could happen faster depending on the location and severity of the wound. And once death occurred, reanimation followed. Always. There was no cure, no treatment. No amount of antibiotics or antivirals or prayer could stop the progression once the active agent entered the bloodstream. The only intervention that showed any success was amputation, cutting off the infected limb before the virus could spread to the rest of the body. Herschel Green, an elderly farmer and veterinarian who became one of the most important figures in the early survivor communities, had his leg amputated with a hatchet by Rick Grimes after being bitten in a prison corridor. It saved his life, but it only worked because Rick acted within seconds, before the infection could travel past the wound site. For most people, by the time they realised they'd been bitten, it was already too late. The virus revealed its cruelty in stages. It wasn't enough to kill you. It wasn't enough to bring you back. It made the people who loved you watch. It forced fathers to put down their sons and daughters, to bury their mothers and friends, to drive knives into the skulls of people they'd known for decades. Because the only way to stop a walker, the only way to truly end the reanimation, was to destroy the brain. A bullet to the head, a blade through the temple, a heavy blow to the skull. Anything that destroyed the brainstem severed the connection between the virus and the body it was puppeting. This fact, this grim necessity, broke people in ways that the walkers themselves never could. The physical danger was one thing. You could build walls against the dead. You could learn to fight them, to clear them, to move through them. But the psychological toll of killing someone who wore the face of a person you loved, of driving a knife into the skull of your neighbour, or your child, or your spouse, that was the wound that never healed. It was the wound the virus inflicted, not on the body, but on the soul. The prison flu epidemic, in the third year of the outbreak, proved just how insidious wildfire could be, even without a single walker involved. A mundane illness, the kind of respiratory infection that would have been treated with bed rest and antibiotics in the old world, swept through the survivor community living in a converted prison in rural Georgia. The pathogen was traced to feral pigs that had been feeding near the fences, carrying diseases that thrived in the close quarters of the cell blocks. A young man named Patrick was one of the first to fall ill. He died quietly in the night, in the showers, from a fever that burned through him in a matter of hours. And then he stood back up. Patrick walked the dark corridors of cell block D in the hours before dawn, and he found a sleeping man, and he bit into the man's throat before anyone knew what was happening. By morning, the cell block had become a slaughterhouse. Multiple people dead, multiple people reanimated, and the survivors scrambling to contain a threat that had materialized inside their own walls, inside their own home, without a single walker having breached the fences. The implications were staggering. It meant that the virus didn't need the dead to wage war on the living. A common cold, a bad case of the flu, a wound that got infected, any cause of death would trigger reanimation. The walkers outside the walls were the obvious threat, the visible enemy, the thing you could see coming. But the real danger was always inside, always invisible, always waiting in the bodies of the people standing next to you. Carol Pelletier understood this before almost anyone else. She was a quiet woman, a survivor of domestic abuse who had lost her daughter Sophia in the early days of the outbreak, and had slowly, painfully transformed herself into one of the most capable and ruthless people in the group. When two members of the community, Karen and David, showed signs of the flu, Carol made a decision that would define her for years to come. She took them to an isolated area of the prison, and she killed them. Then she burned their bodies to prevent reanimation and to stop the disease from spreading. It was a monstrous act. It was also, by the cold logic of a world governed by the wildfire virus, an entirely rational one. Tyrese, who had been in a relationship with Karen, was devastated. He wanted justice. He wanted the killer found and punished. And when the truth came out, it nearly tore the community apart. But Carol had done the math that no one else was willing to do. 2 deaths now, contained and controlled, versus a cascading outbreak that could kill everyone. In the world of wildfire, mercy and murder had become the same thing. Herschel Green's story offered the other side of that equation. When the flu reached the isolation ward of the prison, where the sickest patients were quarantined, Herschel refused to abandon them. He walked into that ward knowing that the people inside were dying, knowing that they would reanimate, knowing that he was risking his own life with every breath he took in that contaminated air. And he stayed. He brewed elderberry tea, he held hands, he spoke words of comfort to people who were slipping away, and when they died and came back, he put them down with as much dignity as the situation allowed, dragging the reanimated bodies out of sight of the other patients so they wouldn't have to watch. Herschel believed, even in a world governed by the wildfire virus, that how you treated people mattered, that the manner in which you faced death, yours or someone else's, was the last measure of your humanity. It was a philosophy that cost him his life eventually, when the governor, a man who had no interest in such ideas, took Herschel's head with a sword in front of his daughters. But it was also a philosophy that kept other people alive, not just physically, but spiritually, in the sense that they still recognized themselves as human beings and not just animals competing for survival. That tension between Carroll's pragmatism and Herschel's compassion, between the cold logic of survival and the warm irrationality of hope, ran through every community that formed in the years after the outbreak. It was the fundamental question that the wildfire virus forced upon every survivor. How much of your humanity are you willing to sacrifice to stay alive? And at what point does survival itself become meaningless if you've lost everything that made the living worth doing? The virus didn't ask these questions. The virus didn't care about morality or philosophy or the anguished debates of frightened people huddled behind walls. The virus was simple. It was elegant. It was, in its own terrible way, perfect. It infiltrated every living body on the planet. It waited for death. And when death came, it turned that body into a weapon aimed at the living, ensuring that more death would follow, and more reanimation, and more weapons, in a cycle that had no end and no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. Some survivors, the ones who had the luxury of quiet moments and the inclination to think about such things, wondered whether wildfire was truly mindless, whether it was just a pathogen following its biological programming, or whether there was something more deliberate at work. The way it spread, the way it waited, the way it turned every human weakness, grief, love, mercy, the inability to harm someone who wore a familiar face, into a vector for its own expansion. It was almost as if the virus understood humanity, as if it had studied its host species and identified exactly the cracks in the armor it needed to exploit. But those were thoughts for quiet moments, and quiet moments in the world that wildfire built were rare, and getting rarer, because the virus wasn't just reshaping biology, it was reshaping geography, it was reshaping the very planet itself. And the creatures it left behind, the walkers, the dead that walked, were only the beginning of what it was capable of creating. The first thing survivors learned about the walkers was that they were slow, shuffling, stumbling, dragging themselves forward with the graceless persistence of something that had forgotten how legs worked. A single walker was barely a threat to anyone who could jog. You could sidestep one the way you'd sidestep a puddle on the sidewalk. You could push one away with a stiff arm. You could outpace one at a leisurely walk if you kept your wits about you and watched your footing. But the walkers were never alone. That was the second thing survivors learned, and it was the lesson that killed more people than any other. They moved in herds, dozens at first, then hundreds, then thousands, drawn together by sound and movement, and some dim, wordless instinct that none of them possessed individually, but all of them shared collectively. A single gunshot could draw walkers from miles in every direction, and they would converge on the source of the noise with a patience that bordered on geological. They didn't get tired. They didn't get discouraged. They didn't stop. A herd of walkers moving through a landscape was like water flowing downhill. It went around obstacles and through gaps and over anything that couldn't resist its weight, and it kept going until something stopped it, or there was nothing left to draw it forward. Rick Grimes encountered his first herd on the highway outside Atlanta, a river of the dead flowing between the abandoned cars. Hundreds of bodies pressed together in a mass that stretched farther than the eye could see. His group survived by hiding under the vehicles, lying motionless on the asphalt, barely breathing, while the dead shuffled past them inches away. It was a lesson in stillness, in silence, in the art of becoming invisible in a world that wanted to consume you. The walkers operated on instinct alone. Whatever the wildfire virus restarted in the brainstem gave them the ability to detect the living through sound, movement, and smell. They were drawn to noise the way moths are drawn to light, blindly and irresistibly. They could smell fresh blood from surprising distances, and they could see motion, though their visual acuity deteriorated as their bodies decayed, and many of the older walkers were functionally blind, navigating by sound and scent alone. Survivors quickly identified two baseline behavioral types. Roamers were the more common variety, the walkers who wandered endlessly through streets and fields, and forests, following whatever stimulus crossed their path. They were predictable, dangerous in numbers, but manageable if you knew how to avoid drawing their attention. Lurkers were something else. Lurkers were walkers that had settled into a state of near dormancy, lying on the ground or sitting in corners or slumped against walls, motionless and silent, easy to mistake for truly dead corpses. Until you got too close, until you made a sound, until you brushed against one in a dark corridor, and it seized your ankle with a grip that was far stronger than any decayed body had a right to possess. Lurkers killed more experienced survivors than roamers did, because experienced survivors had learned to handle the obvious threats. They knew how to clear a room, how to move quietly, how to dispatch a walker with a quick blade to the temple. What they didn't always account for was the body on the floor that wasn't quite dead enough to ignore, a mistake you usually only made once. As the years passed, the walkers decayed, their flesh softened, their bones became brittle. The older walkers were almost pitiable, their bodies so deteriorated that they could barely hold themselves together, their moans reduced to wet, bubbling whispers. A walker that had been walking for 5 or 6 years was a shadow of the threat it had been in the early days. It could still kill you if you were careless, but it was fragile, easily dispatched, almost fragile enough to feel sorry for. But the virus, it turned out, was not content with fragility. In the 11th year of the outbreak, something changed. Survivors in Virginia began encountering walkers that didn't behave like any they'd seen before. These walkers could climb. They scaled walls and fences with a fluidity that suggested not just motor function, but something approaching awareness. They could open doors, turning handles with deliberate, purposeful movements. They didn't just stumble toward noise. They stalked. They waited. They chose their moments with a patience that looked unsettlingly like intelligence. Aaron, a recruiter for the Alexandria Safe Zone, was one of the first to encounter these variant walkers on the road to Oceanside. The experience shook him badly enough that he reported it to the community's leadership, but the implications were hard to accept. For more than a decade, every survival strategy, every defensive plan, every assumption about the dead had been built on the foundation that walkers were mindless, that they couldn't learn, that they couldn't adapt. If that foundation was crumbling, then everything built on top of it was in jeopardy. But Virginia's variants were nothing compared to what was happening in France. When Daryl Dixon washed ashore on the southern coast of France near Marseille, burned and disoriented and very far from home, the first walker he encountered grabbed his arm, not with teeth, with its hand, and where its fingers touched his skin, the flesh burned. A chemical burn, deep and immediate, as if the walker's blood had turned to acid. The nuns at the Abbey of St. Bernadette, who found him and brought him in, had to cauterize the wound to prevent the infection from spreading through his body. Sister Isabel, who tended to his injuries, told him something that reframed everything he thought he knew about the dead. In France, she said, there were different kinds. Burners were just one variety. The burner variant was unlike anything seen in America. These walkers had acidic blood that burned through flesh on contact. Their veins were visibly distended, pulsing with a fluid that could eat through skin and clothing and, in sufficient quantities, even dissolve organic barriers, like the overgrown vines that blocked doorways and passages throughout the ruined cities of France. Darrell actually used the body of a dead burner as a tool at one point, pressing its leaking form against a wall of vegetation to melt through it and create an escape route. The walkers had become, in a grim twist, useful. The origin of the burners was debated among the French survivors. Some believed they were a natural mutation of the virus, an evolutionary adaptation that occurred because France was ground zero for the outbreak, and the virus had simply had more time and more hosts to experiment with. Others whispered a darker explanation. A man named Remy, a survivor travelling with Carole Pelletier, told her that rumours circulated among the French that the burners were the result of failed experiments conducted by the Power of the Living, a paramilitary organisation led by a woman named Marion Genet. According to the rumours, Genet's scientists had been trying to create controllable walker variants for use as weapons, and the burners were a mistake that got loose. The truth was probably a combination of both, because Genet's experiments were very real, and they produced something far more terrifying than burners. The AMPA variant was a deliberately engineered walker. Dr. Lafleur, a scientist working under Genet's authority, developed a serum that could be injected into a recently dead body or an existing walker to produce a mutation of extraordinary violence. AMPAs were faster than any walker had a right to be. They were more aggressive, they were stronger. Their eyes turned completely black, and they attacked with a ferocity that made standard walkers look docile by comparison. They would even attack other walkers, something no natural variant had ever been observed doing. The process was imperfect. Many of Lafleur's test subjects simply died again, their heads exploding within 18 to 30 seconds of receiving the serum, the mutation burning through them too quickly for the body to sustain. Lafleur was constantly adjusting the dosage, trying to find the threshold between transformation and destruction. He needed soldiers he could control, not time bombs. And to produce those soldiers, he needed fresh bodies, which meant he needed to kill people, which meant that the line between experimenting on the dead and murdering the living had ceased to exist. Darrell witnessed this firsthand. He watched as guerrier Genet's soldiers executed prisoners in front of Lafleur's outdoor laboratory. He watched as the serum was injected into the freshly dead. He watched as some of them convulsed and burst, and others rose with black eyes and lunged at the nearest living person with a speed that made even hardened survivors flinch. It was assembly line horror, the industrialization of death itself. And then there was what happened in New York City, in the sewers beneath Manhattan, where moisture and darkness and years of undisturbed decay created conditions that existed nowhere else. Something emerged that defied classification entirely. Multiple walkers, pressed together in the tight, wet confines of the tunnels, had fused. Their bodies had grown into each other, flesh merging with flesh, bone knitting to bone, until what remained was a single organism made of 4 or more individual walkers. Survivors called it the Walker King. It was massive. It was nearly impossible to kill, and it moved with a coordinated, multi-directional awareness that suggested the fused bodies were somehow communicating, sharing whatever dim impulse the virus provided, amplifying it through their combined mass. In the Channel Tunnel connecting France to England, Darrell and Carole and their companions encountered yet another variety. The tunnel had been sealed for years, and in the darkness, a bioluminescent fungus had colonized the walls and floors, and the bodies of the walkers that lay dormant within. The fungus glowed with an eerie blue-green light, and the air was thick with bat guano that, in sufficient concentrations, was psychoactive. The group began to hallucinate as they moved through the tunnel. Carol saw her daughter Sophia, dead for over a decade, standing in the darkness ahead of her. She followed the vision into a service tunnel, fighting off walkers while her mind showed her the face of the child she had lost. And in that hallucinatory fog, something shifted inside her. She'd carried the guilt of Sophia's death for 13 years, the weight of a mother who couldn't protect her child. In the tunnel, surrounded by glowing fungus and the moans of the dead, she finally let Sophia go. She watched the vision of her daughter turn and walk away, and she smiled, and she let her go. It was a moment of grace in a place that should have offered none, and it spoke to something essential about the walking dead's world that the virus could never fully erase. Even in the deepest darkness, even in the most inhuman circumstances, the human capacity for healing persisted. Battered and bruised, and often too late, but persistent. The walkers in all their forms, from the stumbling roamers of rural Georgia to the acid-blooded burners of France, to the fused monstrosity in the sewers of Manhattan, represented something beyond a biological threat. They were mirrors. Distorted, rotting, grotesque mirrors, but mirrors nonetheless. They showed humanity what it looked like, without consciousness, without choice, without the ability to love or create or choose kindness over cruelty. They were the negative image of everything it meant to be alive. And every time a survivor looked into the face of a walker and saw someone they used to know, they were forced to confront the thinnest of lines between what they were and what they could become. The virus didn't just create monsters, it created a constant, walking, moaning reminder that the distance between the living and the dead was measured not in miles but in heartbeats. And heartbeats, in this world, were not guaranteed. The first thing you lost was certainty. The knowledge that tomorrow would arrive more or less the same as today, that the systems holding the world together would continue to hold, that the ground beneath your feet was solid. That was the first casualty. After that, the losses came faster and closer together, and each one stripped away another layer of the life you used to know, until you were standing in the ruins of everything you'd taken for granted, holding a weapon you'd never imagined you would need, surrounded by people who were both the only reason you were still alive, and the greatest source of pain you had ever known. Rick Grimes rode a bicycle away from his first encounter with the dead. A woman in a park, her body destroyed from the waist down, her lips gone, her face a mask of decay, reaching for him with one skeletal hand while she moaned and growled with a hunger that had no memory of who she used to be. He pedalled away from her on a bicycle he found lying on its side, and he rode to his house, and his house was empty, and he sat on his front steps and wept. Morgan Jones saved his life that same day, a man hiding in his neighbour's house with his son Dwayne, surviving day to day, terrified to make a sound after dark because the walkers could see light through the windows. Morgan explained the rules of this new world to Rick over dinner. Don't go out at night, don't make noise, don't open the curtains, don't get bitten because the fever will burn through you and then you'll die and then you'll come back as one of them. Simple rules, terrible rules, rules that meant the world Rick had been born into was over and something else had taken its place. Morgan had his own burden. His wife had been bitten in the early days and she had died and she had reanimated, and every night she came back to the house. She walked up the front path and she stood at the door and she turned the handle because some fragment of her, some residual echo buried deep beneath the virus, remembered that she had lived there, that this was home. Morgan watched her through the boarded windows. Every night, and every day he climbed to the second floor with a rifle and tried to put her down from a distance, because he knew it was the right thing to do, because he knew she wasn't his wife anymore, because he knew she was a danger to him and to Dwayne. And every day he looked through the scope at her face, and he couldn't pull the trigger. That failure would cost him everything. Months later, his wife would find Dwayne. And Dwayne would hesitate too, because she looked like his mother, because she walked like his mother, because in every way that mattered to the heart of a child, she was his mother. And she bit him. And Morgan was left alone, with a grief so vast and consuming that it would drive him to madness and back again, more than once over the years that followed. Rick found his way to Atlanta, guided by a radio transmission that promised safety and shelter. What he found instead was a city overrun, the streets clogged with the dead, the military presence that had once tried to establish order reduced to burned-out vehicles and scattered bones. He was rescued from the chaos by a man named Glenn Rhee, a former pizza delivery driver who had survived by being fast and smart and utterly willing to do whatever it took to help a stranger he'd never met. Glenn led Rick through the crawling streets to a camp on the outskirts of the city, where a small group of survivors had gathered under Shane's leadership. The camp felt like salvation, tents arranged in a clearing, a fire at night, people doing laundry in a quarry, children playing, the illusion of normalcy so convincing that you could almost forget, for minutes at a time, that the world had ended. Rick found Laurie there, and Carl and the reunion was the first moment of pure, uncontaminated joy he had experienced since waking up in that hospital room. His family was alive. His son was alive. Everything else could be endured as long as that remained true. But the camp was a candle in the wind. A woman named Amy was killed during a walker attack one evening, while the group was gathered around the fire. Her sister Andrea sat with her body through the night, waiting for Amy to come back, holding the gun that she would need to use and refusing to use it until Amy's eyes opened and she could say goodbye one last time. When the eyes did open, they were empty. Andrea said her goodbye and pulled the trigger, and something inside her closed off after that, a door that took years to open again. The group moved on. They always moved on. That was the rhythm of the early days. Find a place, settle in, lose it, move on. The farm belonging to Herschel Green and his family became the next refuge, a pastoral estate that felt impossibly peaceful, with horses grazing in the fields and a farmhouse that still had running water from a well. It was there that Rick's group learned a lesson that would define the rest of their lives. Herschel had been keeping walkers in his barn. He believed they were sick, not dead. He believed that somewhere inside those shambling, rotting bodies, the people they used to be were still present, still waiting to be cured. His wife was in that barn, his neighbours, people he had known for decades. He fed them chickens and kept the barn doors locked and held on to the conviction that one day science would find a way to bring them back. Shane did not share that conviction. Shane had been unravelling for months, consumed by jealousy over Laurie's return to Rick, consumed by rage at a world that rewarded softness with death, consumed by the growing belief that morality was a luxury that none of them could afford. Shane broke open the barn doors and stood in front of the group as the walkers stumbled out into the sunlight, and one by one the survivors put them down. Rick's group, Herschel's group, all of them firing into the bodies of people Herschel had loved, while the old man fell to his knees and wept. And then the last walker came out, a little girl with short hair and a doll's face and a rainbow shirt that was stained with blood and dirt. Sophia, Carol's daughter, the girl they had been searching for since she ran into the woods weeks earlier, the girl whose absence had been the driving force of their entire time at the farm. She'd been in the barn the whole time, bitten, turned and collected by Herschel's people before anyone knew she was missing. She walked out into the light on legs that barely held her, and the group fell silent, and Carol screamed, and Rick stepped forward with his revolver and did what had to be done. That moment broke something in the group that never fully healed. It was the moment when the last traces of the old world's optimism were burned away. The world would not get better. The dead would not be cured. The people you lost were not coming back, not as themselves, not ever. You could search and hope and pray, and the universe would answer with a dead child walking out of a barn. The prison came next, a former correctional facility in the Georgia countryside that offered something no other location had provided. Walls, thick, reinforced concrete walls, topped with razor wire, surrounding exercise yards and cell blocks, and a cafeteria and an infirmary. It was a fortress, and for a time the longest stretch of stability the group would know, it became a home. Rick put down his gun and picked up a shovel. He planted a garden, he raised pigs, he taught Carl about farming instead of fighting, and for a few months, the rhythm of life settled into something almost bearable. The prison was where Judith was born, Rick and Laurie's daughter, delivered by emergency cesarean section, while walkers overran the building around them. Laurie didn't survive the birth. Carl, 13 years old, stayed in the room with his mother's body and did what the world required of him. He made sure she wouldn't come back. The boy who had once begged to be treated like a kid became in that moment something else entirely, something harder, something that the old world would have mourned but the new world desperately needed. The prison was also where the governor found them. Philip Blake, who called himself the governor, was the leader of a community called Woodbury, a small town in Georgia that had been fortified and organised into something resembling civilization. From the outside, Woodbury looked like paradise. Clean streets, running generators, evening entertainment, a sense of order and purpose. From the inside, it was a dictatorship run by a man who kept severed walker heads in fish tanks in his apartment, who staged gladiator fights between his people and captive walkers, and who kept his reanimated daughter chained in a room where he brushed her hair and whispered to her as if she could still hear. The governor laid siege to the prison. He arrived with a tank and an army and a hostage. The hostage was Herschel, and in front of Rick, in front of Maggie and Beth, in front of everyone who had come to love the old man, who brewed tea for the dying and believed in the goodness of people, even when every shred of evidence suggested otherwise, the governor took Herschel's head with Michonne's katana. The prison fell, the group scattered, and the road swallowed them again. What followed was a period of wandering that tested every survivor to their absolute limit. Separated from each other, moving in small groups through the Georgia wilderness, starving, dehydrated, hunted by both the dead and the living, they made their way toward a place called Terminus. The signs were everywhere, nailed to trees and posted along railroad tracks, hand-painted messages that read, "Those who arrive survive," with a map pointing to a location that promised sanctuary. Terminus was not a sanctuary, it was a trap. The people who ran it had once offered genuine shelter to travellers. Years earlier, before a group of marauders had invaded and brutalised them so severely that the survivors of that violence decided the only way to ensure their safety was to become predators themselves. They lured people in with signs and open gates and warm welcomes, and then they killed them, and they ate them. When Rick's group arrived, they were separated, disarmed, and led to a trough in a slaughterhouse, where men with baseball bats and butcher's knives prepared to bleed them out. They escaped. Rick, Daryl, Glenn, Bob, they fought their way out with the help of Carol, who had arrived separately and used a walker herd and a sniper rifle, and a truly incredible amount of nerve to tear Terminus apart from the outside, while the others fought from within. Carol, the quiet woman who had once been afraid of her own husband, walked through the fire she had started with a stolen rifle slung over her shoulder, and the look of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what the world demanded of her. When the survivors reunited outside Terminus, bloody and shaken and alive against all odds, Rick made a statement that captured the essential truth of their existence. "The fences are down," Maggie said, arguing that they should leave the Terminus survivors to their fate. Rick wanted to go back. He wanted to finish what they had started, but in the end, they walked away. They always walked away. into the next chapter, the next crisis, the next place that would promise safety and deliver something else entirely. And somewhere in the distance, a walker that used to be someone's teacher or someone's accountant or someone's best friend shuffled along the road behind them, following the sound of their voices, patient and tireless, one step at a time. There comes a point in any apocalypse where the survivors stop running and start building. Not because the danger has passed, but because the human mind can only sustain the flight response for so long before it demands something else. A door that locks, a roof that doesn't leak, a place where you can close your eyes for more than an hour without wondering whether you'll open them again. The need for shelter is older than language, older than fire, and in the world that wildfire built, that need became the driving force behind everything that followed. Alexandria was the first real community that Rick Grimes and his people encountered that felt like it might actually work. Tucked into a residential neighborhood in Virginia, surrounded by reinforced steel walls that had been erected by a construction crew in the early days of the outbreak, Alexandria was the vision of a woman named Deanna Monroe. A former congresswoman from Ohio, Deanna had survived the collapse with a clarity of purpose that most people had lost. She believed that the outbreak was temporary, that civilization would return, and that the communities that preserved knowledge, culture, and democratic governance would be the ones to lead humanity back from the edge. Inside Alexandria's walls, there was electricity. Solar panels lined the rooftops, powering lights and appliances, and a sense of normalcy that was almost disorienting to people who had spent years living in the dirt. There were houses with kitchens and bedrooms and bathrooms with running water. There was a pantry stocked with canned goods and dry supplies. There were job assignments, a leadership council, and a process for welcoming new residents that included an interview recorded on video. Deanna wanted a record. She wanted to document what they were building so that future generations could look back and see that even in the darkest hours, people had chosen order over chaos. Rick's group arrived at Alexandria's gates hollow-eyed and feral. They had spent months on the road since the fall of the prison, surviving Terminus and the cannibals, and the long, brutal winter that followed. They were armed to the teeth and wired for violence, and the people of Alexandria, who had been sheltered behind their walls since the early days of the outbreak, looked at them with a mixture of fear and fascination. These were people who had never killed a walker up close, people who still held dinner parties and book clubs and worried about their gardens. They had survived by being lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, and they had no idea how fragile their safety truly was. Rick saw that fragility immediately. He saw the walls and calculated how many walkers it would take to bring them down. He saw the complacency and calculated how many days it would last once a real threat arrived. And he made a decision that would define his relationship with Alexandria for years to come. He would protect these people, even from themselves. He would teach them to fight, to kill, to survive. And if they resisted, if they tried to maintain their comfortable illusions at the expense of the group's safety, he would take Alexandria by force. It never came to that quite, but it came close. And the tension between Alexandria's idealism and Rick's battle-hardened pragmatism became the template for every community conflict that followed. The fundamental question was always the same. How do you build a society worth living in without becoming the kind of people who destroy societies? The hilltop colony, located about a day's drive south of Alexandria, offered a different model. Built on and around a colonial-era mansion that sat atop a hill, the community had the advantage of elevation, farmland, and a blacksmith who could forge weapons and tools. The disadvantage was its leadership. Gregory, the community's appointed leader, was a coward and a politician in the worst sense of the word. A man who maintained his position not through competence or courage, but through flattery and self-preservation. When the saviors came, Gregory folded immediately, agreeing to hand over half of everything the hilltop produced in exchange for not being killed. Maggie Ree changed that. Glenn's widow, pregnant with their son, and grieving in a way that would have destroyed a weaker person, arrived at the hilltop and saw a community that needed what she had. Not physical strength, though she had that too, but the willingness to stand when everyone else was kneeling. Maggie took the hilltop from Gregory, not through violence, but through competence. She organised the defences, she managed the resources, she made the hard calls that Gregory was too afraid to make. And the people followed her, because in a world where survival depended on the quality of your leaders, Maggie was the real thing. The kingdom was something else entirely, a community built in a converted school and its surrounding grounds, led by a man who called himself King Ezekiel and kept a Bengal tiger named Shiva as his companion. Ezekiel was, by his own admission, a fraud. Before the outbreak, he'd been a zookeeper and a community theatre actor. When the world fell apart, he used his theatrical training to create a persona, a benevolent monarch who spoke in formal cadences and projected an aura of calm authority that gave his people something to believe in. The kingdom had gardens and livestock, and a choir that sang in the mornings, and Ezekiel presided over all of it from a makeshift throne with Shiva lounging at his feet. It was absurd. It was also, in its own way, brilliant. People needed something to believe in, and if a man with a tiger and a theatrical vocabulary could provide that, then the performance was worth the effort. Ezekiel knew he was playing a role. He knew the crown was imaginary and the kingdom was a school, but he also knew that the people who lived there were safer and happier and more functional than they would have been without the story he was telling them. Sometimes, a beautiful lie is more useful than an ugly truth. Oceanside was the quietest community, and it had the saddest origin. It was a settlement of women and children, tucked away on the coast, virtually invisible to the outside world. The men were gone, all of them, killed by Negan's saviours as punishment for resisting their demands. The women of Oceanside survived by becoming invisible, by hiding, by refusing to engage with the larger world of communities and alliances and wars. They had spears and fishing nets, and a fierce, quiet determination to outlast everything that had tried to destroy them. And then there were the tyrants. Woodbury has already been spoken of. The governor's illusion of paradise, maintained through violence and fear, and the severed heads he kept in glass tanks in his private rooms. But the governor was a small-time dictator, a local horror. What came after him was something on a different scale entirely. Negan arrived like a storm front. You could feel him coming before you saw him. The saviours, his army, numbered in the hundreds, spread across multiple outposts and fortifications, and they operated on a simple principle. Give us half of everything you have, or we will kill you. Not some of you, not the ones who resist. All of you. Negan's method of enforcement was a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. He called it Lucille, named after his wife who had died of cancer before the outbreak. A woman he had loved poorly when she was alive and memorialised obsessively after she was gone. Lucille the Bat became the most feared object in the known world. The night Negan introduced himself to Rick's group remains the single most devastating moment in the franchise's history. He lined them up on their knees in a clearing in the woods, a dozen survivors who had fought their way through every horror the world could throw at them, and he walked back and forth in front of them with Lucille on his shoulder, smiling, joking, drawing out the moment with a theatrical cruelty of someone who genuinely enjoyed the power he held. And then he chose Glenn, the man who had rescued Rick from Atlanta, the man who had married Maggie and loved her with a devotion that the apocalypse couldn't diminish, the man who was going to be a father. Negan brought Lucille down on Glenn's skull, and then he did it again and again, and the person who had been the group's heart and conscience was reduced to something that barely resembled a human being, while Maggie screamed and the others looked away, and Negan told them that this was the cost of disobedience. The sanctuary, Negan's home base, was a converted factory surrounded by a fence of walkers, impaled on spikes. Inside, it operated on a point system. You earned points through labour, and you spent points on food, on medicine, on the small comforts that made the difference between enduring and breaking. At the top of this hierarchy was Negan himself, who maintained a harem of women he called his wives, women who had chosen him not out of love, but out of the calculation that being Negan's wife was better than the alternative. It was a kingdom built on coercion, and everyone inside it knew it, and most of them accepted it because the alternative was Lucille. The war against the Saviors lasted 2 years and cost more lives than anyone could count. But it ended. Negan was defeated, imprisoned, and locked in a cell in Alexandria's basement, where he would remain for years. A living reminder of what unchecked power looked like in a world without laws. The Whisperers were different from any group that came before. They didn't build walls, they didn't claim territory, they didn't negotiate or trade or seek alliance. They walked among the dead. Literally. Wearing the skin of walkers, draped over their bodies, masks made from the faces of the reanimated, Alpha and her followers moved through herds of walkers as if they were part of them. To the dead, the Whisperers smelled like death. They moved like death. They were invisible. Alpha believed that civilization was the problem, not the solution. She believed that the outbreak was nature correcting a mistake, stripping away the artificial constructs of society and returning humanity to its natural state. In Alpha's world, there was no community, no law, no love. There was only the pack, and the pack survived by being more brutal than whatever wanted to kill it. When the Whisperers marked their territory, they didn't use signs or flags. They used the heads of the people they had killed, mounted on pikes along a border that stretched through the Virginia countryside. The pike border remains one of the most haunting images in The Walking Dead's history. Survivors from Alexandria, the Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Oceanside, 10 people in total, decapitated and displayed in a line that stretched across a ridge. Their faces frozen in death, their heads reanimating on the spikes, mouths opening and closing in soundless moans. It was a message, a clear, unmistakable message that said, "This is what happens when you cross the line." The war with the Whisperers cost the communities their sense of security permanently. The kingdom fell. The hilltop was burned. Alexandria was damaged almost beyond repair. And even after Alpha was killed, even after Beta's herd was defeated, and the survivors reclaimed their territory, the psychological scars remained. They had been reminded with savage clarity that in this world, the greatest threat was never the dead. The dead were predictable. The dead followed rules. The living were the ones who burned your home and mounted your friends' heads on sticks and walked among the corpses wearing their faces. Every community that rose in the aftermath of the outbreak was an experiment, an attempt to answer the question of what human society looks like when all the assumptions of the old world are stripped away. Some experiments succeeded, at least for a while. Some failed spectacularly. Some, like the Kingdom, were built on stories that eventually couldn't sustain themselves. Some, like the Sanctuary, were built on fear that eventually turned inward and consumed its own foundation. And some, like Alexandria, survived through a combination of luck and stubbornness, and the willingness to keep rebuilding every time something knocked the walls down. But none of them existed in isolation. Because while the survivors in Virginia were building and destroying and rebuilding their small communities, larger forces were at work. Organizations with resources and reach and ambitions that dwarfed anything Rick Grimes could have imagined. And they had been watching from the beginning. While the survivors in Virginia were fighting over farms and prisons, and small patches of land behind improvised walls, a city of 250,000 people was thriving in Philadelphia. It had electricity and running water and hospitals and schools and a government with elected officials and a military with helicopters and supply chains and a bureaucracy that processed paperwork and assigned housing. It had restaurants, it had art, it had the kind of infrastructure that the people in Alexandria would have wept to see if they had known it existed. They didn't know. Almost nobody did. Because the Civic Republic of Philadelphia, as it called itself, had made a deliberate and ruthless decision to remain hidden. Its leaders believed, not entirely without reason, that the survival of their city depended on secrecy. If the surrounding world learned of their existence, of the resources they possessed, of the population they sheltered, it would attract every desperate, violent, hungry group of survivors within 1,000 miles. The Civic Republic would become a target. And so the Republic hid, behind layers of security and disinformation and the enforcement arm that kept it all in place, the Civic Republic military, known as the CRM. The CRM was, by the standards of the post-apocalyptic world, the most formidable military force in existence. Tens of thousands of soldiers, well-equipped, well-trained, and stationed at bases and outposts across the eastern United States. They had helicopters, they had armoured vehicles, they had supply depots and intelligence networks, and a chain of command that answered to a single man, Major General Beale, who had decided long ago that the survival of the Civic Republic justified any action, any sacrifice, any atrocity. Beale's worldview was shaped by a single, terrifying calculation. According to the intelligence his people had gathered, humanity had approximately 14 years left. The wildfire virus, dormant in every living person, was eventually going to claim everyone. As the global population continued to decline through violence, starvation, and disease, the number of living humans was approaching a tipping point, below which the species could not sustain itself. In Beale's estimation, the only way to prevent extinction was to consolidate the remaining human population under a single authority, his authority, and eliminate any competing communities that might fragment the survivors or drain resources. This was not a theoretical concern. The CRM had already acted on it. The campus colony of Omaha, a thriving settlement in Nebraska that housed thousands of people, was destroyed by the CRM. Not by walkers, not by raiders, by the organization that was supposed to be protecting them. The CRM engineered the colony's destruction and made it look like an accident, a herd that overwhelmed the defenses, a tragic but unpreventable loss. In reality, it was a calculated murder. Tens of thousands of people eliminated because their existence was deemed a threat to the Civic Republic's monopoly on survival. Portland was next on the list. The third member of the Alliance of the Three, the network of communities that the CRM ostensibly existed to protect, was scheduled for the same treatment. Chlorine gas bombs, the same weapons that had nearly killed Michonne, were being prepared for deployment against a city full of civilians whose only crime was existing independently of the Civic Republic's control. And Rick Grimes was in the middle of all of it, not by choice, never by choice. When Rick detonated the bridge to stop a massive walker herd from reaching the communities he had built, the explosion should have killed him. It nearly did. His body was shattered, bleeding, barely breathing, lying in the shallow water of a riverbank, while the herd poured over the destroyed bridge and tumbled into the current below. He should have died there. He probably wanted to, but Jadis found him. Jadis, the enigmatic leader of the scavengers, the junkyard people, who had oscillated between ally and adversary for years, had been maintaining a secret relationship with the CRM. She had been trading information, supplies, and people to the military in exchange for protection and favours. When she found Rick on that riverbank, She called in a helicopter, and she traded him. Rick was classified as an A by the CRM's taxonomy. A high-value individual, a leader, someone who could be useful to the Republic's long-term plans, or dangerous if left uncontrolled. He was taken to Philadelphia and held for years. His family was told he was dead. Michonne mourned him. Carl had already died from a walker bite sustained while helping a stranger. A death so senseless and so generous that it perfectly encapsulated everything Carl had become. Judith grew up knowing her father as a story, a legend, a man who blew up a bridge to save his people. For years, Rick existed in a limbo of compliance and resistance. He tested the CRM's boundaries. He tried to escape. He was caught and returned and given another chance because the CRM recognized his value and was willing to tolerate a certain amount of defiance in exchange for his cooperation. But compliance came at a cost that Rick was never willing to pay. The CRM wanted him to accept their vision, to believe that the sacrifice of tens of thousands of innocent people was justified in the name of species survival. Rick could not accept that. He had spent too many years fighting for the principle that every life mattered, that the measure of a community was how it treated its most vulnerable members. To abandon that principle now, no matter how compelling the argument for doing so might be. Michonne found him. Because of course she did. Michonne, who had never fully believed that Rick was dead, who had searched for evidence of his survival across years and miles and every dead end imaginable, who had left Alexandria and her children in the care of people she trusted so she could follow the faintest trail of hope across the wilderness. She found her way to the CRM, and she found Rick, and together they did what they had always done best. They fought. The details of their rebellion against the CRM are a story unto themselves. The echelon briefing, the classified intelligence report that revealed the full scope of Beale's plans, the evidence of the Omaha massacre, the chlorine gas, the planned destruction of Portland. Rick and Michonne gathered it all, the proof of every crime the CRM had committed in the name of survival, and they exposed it. Not to the CRM's soldiers, who already knew and followed orders anyway, to the people of the Civic Republic itself, to the 250,000 civilians who had been living behind their walls, ignorant of the blood their military was spilling in their name. It worked. The revelation shattered the CRM's authority. Beale was killed by Rick in a confrontation that was as personal as it was political. The senior military officers were neutralized, one by one, using the CRM's own network of explosives against them. And the Civic Republic, for the first time in its existence, was forced to reckon with the truth of what it had built. A city of survivors protected by a military that had committed genocide in their name. The walls were still standing, the power was still on, the hospitals still functioned and the schools still taught, and the restaurants still served food. But the moral foundation, the story the Republic had told itself about being humanity's last best hope, was in ruins. In the aftermath, the Civic Republic reformed. The CRM was restructured under new leadership. The doors that had been sealed for years were opened, and for the first time, the Republic began to engage with the outside world. Trade was established with the Commonwealth. Communication lines were opened with Alexandria. Helicopters that had once carried soldiers and weapons now carried supplies and envoys. It was not a perfect transformation. The scars of what the CRM had done would take generations to heal, if they ever healed at all. But it was a beginning. The Commonwealth, for its part, had its own reckoning. Located in Ohio, the Commonwealth was a city of over 50,000 residents, the second largest surviving settlement after the Civic Republic. It had been built by a woman named Pamela Milton, the daughter of a former president, who had used her family's connections and resources to establish a community that replicated the class structures of the old world with disturbing fidelity. In the Commonwealth, Your pre-outbreak profession determined your social standing. Doctors and lawyers lived in comfortable homes. Labourers and service workers lived in shared housing. There was an upper class and a lower class, and a military that enforced the boundaries between them, and the entire system was designed to ensure that power remained in the hands of the people who had held it before the world ended. It was civilization rebuilt, but rebuilt with all of the old world's inequalities baked in from the start. The Commonwealth had ice cream shops and bakeries and a concert hall and all the trappings of normalcy, but it also had a rigid hierarchy, a surveillance apparatus, and a governor who believed that the right to govern was inherited, not earned. When Rick's people encountered the Commonwealth, the culture shock ran in both directions. The Alexandrians couldn't believe that a place this large and this organised existed. The Commonwealth's residents couldn't believe that people were still living in the dirt behind improvised walls, fighting for survival on a daily basis. The two communities were separated by more than geography. They were separated by entirely different philosophies about what survival meant and who deserved to benefit from it. Pamela Milton's regime eventually fell, not to walkers or to an external invasion, but to the weight of its own contradictions. Her son Sebastian, entitled and reckless, and protected by his mother's power, killed a Commonwealth resident during a botched robbery. Pamela covered it up. Eugene Porter, a member of Rick's group who had been living in the Commonwealth, exposed the truth on a public radio broadcast. The resulting unrest spiraled into a full-scale revolt that Pamela tried to suppress through martial law, deploying her military against her own citizens and even unleashing a Walker herd into the lower-class neighbourhoods to create a crisis that would justify her crackdown. It didn't work. The people of the Commonwealth, aided by Rick's allies, overthrew Pamela and installed Ezekiel, the former king of the kingdom, as the new governor. Under Ezekiel's leadership, the Commonwealth transitioned to something closer to democracy, with elected representatives and equal rights and trade agreements with Alexandria and the other communities of the coalition. The irony of all of this, the thread that runs through every community and every faction and every power struggle in the Walking Dead's world, is that the living were always more dangerous than the dead. The walkers were a force of nature, mindless, predictable, governed by simple rules that could be learned and exploited. A herd could be redirected, a breach could be sealed, a walker could be put down with a blade to the skull. But a human being with power and fear, and the conviction that their survival justified any action, that was a threat that no wall could contain and no weapon could reliably neutralize. The CRM believed it was saving humanity by destroying communities. Pamela Milton believed she was preserving civilization by maintaining inequality. The governor believed he was protecting Woodbury by annihilating everyone outside its walls. Negan believed he was establishing order by ruling through terror. Alpha believed she was embracing nature by abandoning every value that made humanity worth saving. All of them were wrong, and all of them caused more death, more suffering, more destruction than the walkers ever could. The virus created the conditions for the apocalypse, but it was the living who built it, maintained it, and perpetuated it. The dead just walked. The Atlantic Ocean is roughly 3,000 miles wide, and in the years after the outbreak, it might as well have been 3 million. The infrastructure that had once connected continents, the shipping lanes and flight routes and undersea cables that allowed a person in New York to speak to a person in Paris in the time it takes to blink, all of it was gone. The ocean became what it had been for most of human history, a vast, impassable barrier between worlds that could only guess at each other's existence. America knew nothing of what was happening in Europe. Europe knew nothing of what had become of America. Each side of the water fought its own version of the apocalypse, alone. But the virus didn't care about oceans. The wildfire virus had originated in France, and in France it had a head start. by the time the rest of the world was beginning to comprehend what was happening, France had already been transformed. The laboratory at La Biomedicine, the DDMI facility where the Primrose team had conducted their research, had become ground zero for something far worse than the standard outbreak. Because the scientists who remained after the Primrose team left for Ohio didn't stop working. They couldn't. The catastrophe they had created demanded a response, and the only response they knew was more science, more experiments, more desperate attempts to put the genie back in the bottle. They failed, and their failure made everything worse. The remaining DDMI scientists attempted to mutate the wildfire virus into a variant that would counteract the reanimation process. The theory was elegant. If they could create a strain of wildfire that attacked the reanimated brainstem instead of restarting it, they could develop a treatment, possibly even a vaccine. But the virus was more adaptable than they anticipated, and the mutations they introduced didn't neutralize the threat. They amplified it. The variant strains they created produced walkers that were faster, stronger, more aggressive, and more physiologically distinct than anything that existed naturally. France, the birthplace of the virus, became the testing ground for its evolution. This is the world that Daryl Dixon walked into when he washed ashore near Marseille. Daryl's journey to France was not voluntary. In the months after the fall of the Commonwealth's old regime, a man named Dr. Lafleur had been operating out of Maine, contracting people to find and capture fresh walkers for his experiments. Lafleur was specific in his requirements. No elderly, no children, no one shorter than 5'4". He wanted healthy bodies. Fresher was better. The walkers were being transported by ship to France, where they would be used in experiments conducted under the authority of a woman named Marion Genet, the leader of a paramilitary organization called the Power of the Living, Pouvoir du Vivant in French. Daryl got caught up in this operation through a chain of events that was part bad luck and part the kind of stubborn defiance that had kept him alive for 13 years. He was captured, placed on a ship with the walker cargo, and marked as expendable. The prisoners on the ship were meant to serve as food for the experimental walkers during the crossing, but Daryl staged a mutiny. In the chaos that followed, he encountered one of Lafleur's experimental subjects, an amper, a walker that had been enhanced with the serum to be faster and more violent than anything Daryl had ever fought. The ship exploded. Daryl went into the water, and the current carried him to France. He arrived burned, disoriented, and alone on a rocky coastline that looked nothing like home. The first walker he encountered burned his arm on contact, and he stumbled through the abandoned streets of Marseille until Isabelle Carrière found him. Isabelle was a nun at the Abbey of Sainte Bernadette, a small religious community in the French countryside that had survived the outbreak through a combination of farming, scavenging, and an armoury of medieval weapons that the sisters had taught themselves to use. The abbey was modest, isolated, and fiercely protective of its secrets, because the abbey was sheltering something that multiple factions in France were willing to kill for. Laurent was a boy of about 12, quiet and thoughtful, with a quality that people found difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. He had been born under circumstances that defied explanation. His mother had been bitten during pregnancy. She died. She reanimated. And somehow, impossibly, the child she was carrying survived the process. Laurent was born from a walker, a living child delivered from a dead mother. The implications of this were staggering, and they had attracted the attention of two opposing forces. The Union of Hope, or Union de l'Espoir, was a loose network of faith-based communities scattered across France that believed Laurent was special, not just biologically, but spiritually. They believed his birth was a miracle, a sign that humanity's suffering was a test from which they would eventually be delivered. The Union believed Laurent might be immune to the wildfire virus, and that his immunity could hold the key to a cure. Their faith in this belief was absolute, and it drove them to protect Laurent at any cost, even at the cost of their own lives. The power of the living saw Laurent through a very different lens. Marion Genet had no interest in miracles or spiritual deliverance. She was a pragmatist and an authoritarian who had built her organization on the principle that the old world's weakness, its compassion, its hesitation, its democratic instincts, was what had allowed the outbreak to destroy civilization. Genet believed that strength was the only currency that mattered in the New World, and she intended to accumulate as much of it as possible. Her scientists were creating Walker variants, not out of curiosity, but out of a calculated strategy to build an army of controllable, undead soldiers that could enforce her will across France, and eventually beyond. The experiments were horrifying in their efficiency. Prisoners were executed in front of Lafleur's mobile laboratory. The freshly dead were injected with the Ampere serum. Timers were started, and the scientists watched, taking notes, as the bodies either convulsed and died permanently or rose as something new. The successful subjects, the ones whose heads didn't explode within 30 seconds, became ampers, black-eyed, screaming, violent creatures that attacked anything living, including other walkers. Lafleur adjusted the dosage after each batch, trying to find the sweet spot between transformation and destruction. He needed his weapons to last more than half a minute. He needed them controllable, and he was willing to burn through as many human lives as necessary to achieve that goal. Daryl's mission, which was never really a mission so much as a series of impossible situations that he couldn't walk away from, became the protection of Laurent. Isabelle asked for his help. The Union of Hope needed to transport Laurent to a safer location, away from Genet's expanding reach, and Daryl, despite every instinct telling him to find a boat and go home, agreed. Because that was who Daryl was. The man who couldn't walk away from someone who needed him. The man who had promised Judith, back in America, that he would find Rick and Michonne and bring them home, and who had ended up on the wrong side of an ocean with a child who might be the most important person in the world. The journey across France revealed a landscape that was both familiar and alien. The ruins were recognizable, the empty highways, the crumbling buildings, the overgrown fields, but the details were different. The walkers were different. Burners with their acidic blood, ampers with their black eyes and impossible speed. Things Carole Pelletier's companion Remy described as failed experiments that got loose. France wasn't just suffering from the same outbreak as America. It was suffering from the compounded consequences of trying to cure it. Every attempt to fix the virus had produced something worse, and those worse things had been released into the wild, and they had spread, and they had changed the calculus of survival in ways that even hardened veterans like Daryl weren't prepared for. Carol came to France looking for Daryl. That was the simplest way to explain it, though the truth was more complicated. Carol had told Ash, the pilot who flew her across the Atlantic in a small propeller plane, that she was looking for her daughter. She had told herself the same lie, perhaps. Sophia was long dead. Carol knew that, but the search for Sophia had become, over the years, a metaphor for something larger. The search for the parts of herself that the world had tried to take, the search for the capacity to love and protect that she had been denied as an abused wife. Denied again when Sophia walked out of Herschel's barn. Denied again and again by a world that seemed determined to punish her for caring. The Channel Tunnel crossing was where Carol finally found what she was looking for. Not Daryl, not Sophia, peace. In the hallucinogenic darkness of that fungus-choked tunnel, surrounded by bioluminescent walkers and choking on psychoactive guano, Carol saw her daughter, not as a walker, not as a corpse, as a child, alive and warm and whole. And when the vision of Sophia turned and walked away into the darkness, Carol let her go. She smiled, and she let her go. After 13 years, she let her go. In Greenland, on the route to France, Carol had met a woman named Hannah, who lived at a remote research station with her partner Hune. They'd come to study glacier melt and been stranded by the outbreak. Hannah had developed a philosophy about the walkers that was unlike anything Carol had heard before. She didn't see them as monsters or victims, or even as threats exactly. She saw them as nature's correction, Mother Nature fighting back against a species that had consumed everything in its path. The Tupalag, she called them, after an old Inuit myth, a flesh-eating beast conjured for revenge on your enemy. But if the beast couldn't find its target, it came home and killed its maker instead. It was a chilling metaphor, because humanity had made the wildfire virus, or at least humanity's scientists had, in a laboratory in France, for reasons that no one fully understood or was willing to explain. And now the virus had come home. It had consumed its maker, and it was still hungry. Laurent remained at the centre of all of it, the boy who might be immune, the boy born from a dead mother. The Union of Hope wanted to protect him. Janet wanted to study him, or kill him, or use him, depending on which version of her plan was ascendant at any given moment. And Daryl, who had never asked to be anyone's protector, who had never aspired to anything more than surviving another day and finding his way back to the people he cared about, stood between Laurent and a world that wanted to either worship him or dissect him. The question of Laurent's immunity was never fully resolved. Losang, a leader within the Union of Hope, wanted to test it the most direct way possible. A walker bite, put the boy in front of the dead and see if the virus took hold. If Laurent survived, it would prove everything the Union believed. If he didn't, well, martyrs were useful too. Isabelle refused to allow it. She had raised Laurent. She had loved him as her own. And she was not willing to gamble his life on faith, no matter how fervent that faith might be. The conflict between faith and pragmatism, between the Union's hope and Janet's ruthlessness, between protecting a child and using him as a symbol, was France's version of the same question that every community in every corner of the Walking Dead's world was asking: what are we willing to sacrifice? And is what we're fighting for worth the cost? France didn't have a clean answer. Nobody did. Manhattan was an island in every sense of the word. Before the outbreak, it had been the beating heart of New York City, a place where millions of people lived and worked and moved through streets so crowded that you could spend your entire day surrounded by human beings and never make eye contact with a single one. After the outbreak, it became something else, a sealed tomb. The military, in those desperate early days when they still believed containment was possible, destroyed the bridges and collapsed the tunnels. They were trying to keep the dead from spreading to the rest of the city, to the rest of the state, to the rest of the country. What they actually did was trap everyone still alive on the island with the dead, and then they left. For years, Manhattan existed in the imagination of the surrounding survivors as a kind of mythical forbidden zone, a place where once home to 1.5 million people was now home only to the dead. The skyline was still visible from certain vantage points along the New Jersey shore and the Brooklyn waterfront, the towers still standing against the sky like headstones in the world's largest graveyard. Nobody went in. The few who tried didn't come back. The island had been surrendered to the walkers, and the walkers had made it their own. But Manhattan wasn't empty, not quite. Because human beings, in their stubborn and infuriating refusal to die when the world tells them to, had survived even there. Small groups clinging to the upper floors of buildings, scavenging in the ruins, learning the patterns of the herds that flowed through the streets below like tides. They formed factions, as survivors always did, and those factions fought over the only thing that mattered on an island with no escape: resources, food, water, weapons, and eventually something that nobody had expected to find in the ruins of a dead city: power. Literal power. The Baradzi, a paramilitary group operating out of St. Patrick's Cathedral, had discovered that the bodies of the dead could be harvested for methane. The decomposition of thousands of corpses, collected and processed in the cathedral's basement, produced enough gas to generate electricity. For the first time since the military sealed the island, lights came on in Manhattan. Not many, not everywhere, but enough. Enough to change the calculus of survival, enough to make the island worth fighting over again. The man at the center of Manhattan's power struggle was a figure that the Walking Dead survivors knew all too well. Negan had been released from his cell in Alexandria years earlier, after the war with the Whisperers had forced the communities to accept help from unlikely sources. He had drifted. He had married a woman named Annie and fathered a son named Joshua. He had tried in his way to become something other than the man who had swung Lucille. But the world had a way of pulling people back to what they were, and when Negan's path crossed with Manhattan, he found himself drawn into a web of manipulation that made the sanctuary look simple by comparison. The Dharma was the true architect of Manhattan's future, though you might not have known it to look at her. She operated from the King Francis Theatre, surrounded by her pet rats and their miniature mazes, and she understood power the way a watchmaker understands gears. She didn't wield it directly. She positioned people and let them wield it for her. The Croat, Negan's former savior lieutenant, commanded the Barazi on her behalf, but the Croat was volatile, emotional. He had a gift for identifying weakness and exploiting it, but he lacked the patience for the long game. The Dharma needed someone who could inspire and terrify in equal measure, someone who could walk into a room full of hostile gang leaders and leave with their loyalty, or at least their compliance. She needed the old Negan, the Negan who had lined people up on their knees and smiled while he swung the bat. To get him, she used the only leverage that mattered. She found his family. Annie and Joshua, traveling by wagon train toward Missouri, rerouted by a flood to Memphis, Tennessee. The Dharma's reach extended farther than anyone in Manhattan would have guessed, and she dangled Negan's wife and son in front of him, like a key to a cage, promising reunion in exchange for his cooperation. It was the same transaction that every tyrant in The Walking Dead's history had offered. Safety for obedience, love as a weapon. Maggie came to Manhattan for a simpler reason, though nothing in The Walking Dead is ever truly simple. Her son Herschel had been taken. The boy named for his grandfather, the boy whose father Glenn had died under Lucille, had been captured by the Croat and brought to the island. To get him back, Maggie needed Negan. The irony was not lost on either of them. The woman whose husband Negan had murdered, forced to work alongside the murderer to save the son that murder had orphaned. They didn't discuss it. They didn't need to. The weight of it sat between them in every silence, in every exchanged glance, in the way Maggie's hand sometimes drifted toward her weapon when Negan was too close. Manhattan itself was a character in the story. The overgrown streets where trees pushed through cracked asphalt and ivy consumed entire buildings. Central Park, which had become a no-man's land so dense with walkers that none of the factions dared cross it. A green buffer zone between territories maintained not by diplomacy, but by the sheer number of dead things wandering beneath the canopy. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, occupied by a silver-tongued faction leader named Bruegel, who had filled the galleries with mirrors to reflect the natural light and surrounded himself with the stolen beauty of a civilization that no longer existed. The cathedral where bodies were rendered into fuel and fuel was rendered into power, and power was the only currency that anyone respected. The gangs of Manhattan operated on a monthly cycle of trade, gambling, and sport at a plaza that Bruegel had organised. Weapons, food, armour, shelter, all of it changed hands in a marketplace that functioned on the oldest principle of commerce: what you have that I want. The Dharma wanted to unite these gangs under her banner, with Negan as the face of that unity, and before a larger threat arrived. New Babylon, a governing body that claimed authority over the region, had discovered the methane operation and was sending soldiers to seize it. Negan, dragging Lucille through the cathedral before eventually dropping it, found himself caught between the person he used to be and the person he was trying to become. The Dharma wanted the old Negan, the one who ruled through fear and charisma and the promise of violence. But that Negan had cost him everything. His people, his freedom, 7 years in a cell, the respect of anyone whose respect was worth having. Picking up that bat again, even metaphorically, meant becoming the thing he had spent years trying to leave behind. And yet he did it, because Ginny needed him. Ginny was a girl who had attached herself to Negan in the way that children in the apocalypse attach themselves to anyone who made them feel safe. She had stopped speaking, retreated into a selective mutism that was her mind's way of surviving what her body had been forced to endure. Negan became her protector, her anchor, the person she trusted when she didn't trust anyone else. And when Ginny was hurt, when an infection began to burn through her small body, Negan did what Negan always did. He committed, completely, terrifyingly. He retrieved a ventilator from the ruins of Bellevue Hospital and set it up in his cell at the cathedral. He hooked Ginny to life support and sat by her bedside while the world fought over methane and territory and the right to control a dead city. Ginny died while Negan was elsewhere, fighting. She reanimated in her cell, alone, and the growl that came from behind those bars stopped Maggie mid-swing as she stood over Negan with Lucille raised above her head, ready to finally end what had started in that clearing in the woods years ago. The sound of the dead child behind the bars was enough to stay the bat. Maggie looked at Negan. Negan looked at the cell, and then they both saw the truth of it. The ventilator, the medical supplies scattered everywhere, the lengths this man had gone to for a child who wasn't his. Maggie handed him a knife, silently, and Negan reached through the bars and put Ginny down. He wept. He sat on the floor of that cathedral and he wept in a way that the old Negan would never have allowed himself to. Not the performative grief of a man who named a bat after his dead wife. Real grief, the kind that comes from failing to protect someone small and innocent and trusting, the kind that strips away every defense and every persona and leaves you with nothing but the raw fact of loss. Maggie watched, and something changed in her that had been calcifying for years. She went to the New York Times building where Herschel was waiting, and she told her son the truth, that she hadn't killed Negan, that killing him wouldn't heal what was broken, that vengeance was a door that opened onto nothing, and she was tired of walking through it. Herschel didn't understand, not yet. He was young and angry, and he had grown up in the shadow of his father's murder, and the idea that the murderer deserved to live was a concept that his grief couldn't accommodate. He pushed his mother away, but Maggie stayed. She told him she would always be there. She told him they would find another way forward, and she meant it, even though she couldn't see what that way looked like yet. Manhattan, in the end, was a parable about power and the people who pursue it. The Dharma survived the fire that should have killed her and returned with burned skin and shortened hair and the same patient smile. New Babylon's second wave of soldiers marched into the city and seized the methane, led by a young man named Benjamin, who didn't look entirely happy about the conquest. From a rooftop, Herschel and the Dharma watched the New Babylonians take control, and whatever passed between them in that moment, whatever arrangement or understanding or manipulation was at work, remained hidden from everyone else. The Dharma was still playing the long game. The maze was still being run, and Herschel, the boy named for a man who believed in the goodness of people, was standing beside a woman who believed in nothing but leverage. The story of Dead City was the story of the entire Walking Dead, compressed into a single island. The dead below, the living fighting above, and the resources that could save everyone being hoarded by whoever held the most power at any given moment. Nothing was resolved, nothing was finished. Manhattan was still there, its towers silhouetted against the sky, the Statue of Liberty visible from the rooftops, green with patina and surrounded by water, that no one could cross without risking everything. A monument to a world that had believed in something larger than survival. A reminder that such beliefs, however naive they might seem in the light of what came after, were the only things that had ever made survival worth the effort. The wildfire virus reshaped the planet. The walkers reclaimed the cities. The communities rose and fell and rose again. But at the centre of all of it, holding the weight of this world on their shoulders, were the people. Not as categories or archetypes, but as specific human beings with specific histories and specific scars, each one carrying their own version of the question that the apocalypse forced upon everyone who survived it. Who am I now? Who am I becoming? And is the person I'm becoming someone worth being? Rick Grimes spent the first hours of the apocalypse in a hospital gown, riding a bicycle away from a woman whose lower body was gone, but whose hunger was not. He spent the next 13 years becoming something that the old world would not have recognized and the new world could not function without. A leader, a killer, a father who taught his children to shoot before they could drive, a man who tore out another man's throat with his bare teeth to protect his son, and who stood in the aftermath with blood on his face and told the people watching that they were the ones who should be afraid. But Rick was never comfortable with what the world made him. That was the thing that separated him from the governors and the Negans and the Beals. He did terrible things, and he knew they were terrible, and he carried the weight of every one of them. The farmer who planted gardens in the prison yard was the same man who executed prisoners at Terminus. The sheriff who offered mercy to strangers on the road was the same man who slaughtered the saviours at their outpost in their sleep. Rick contained multitudes, and those multitudes were at war with each other every single day of the apocalypse. When the bridge exploded and the helicopter took him away, Rick spent years in the custody of an organisation that wanted to use his capacity for leadership without the inconvenient moral compass that came attached to it. The CRM offered him power, resources, safety for his family. All he had to do was accept that genocide was a reasonable strategy for species survival. Rick couldn't do it, not because he was naive, but because he had spent too many years fighting for the principle that the measure of a community is how it treats the people it doesn't have to protect. He killed Major General Beale with a sword through the heart and told the dying man that he had never lost his son, that he had only lost himself, and that the people he loved had brought him back. It was the closest Rick Grimes ever came to articulating his philosophy, and he said it while standing over a corpse in a room full of classified documents detailing the planned extermination of an American city. Daryl Dixon's scars told his story before he ever opened his mouth. The cigarette burns on his back, put there by a father who should have protected him. The crossbow bolt wounds and knife cuts accumulated over 13 years of fighting. The chemical burn on his arm from a French walker whose blood could dissolve flesh on contact. Every mark on Daryl's body was a record of someone or something that had tried to destroy him and failed. He survived not through intelligence or charisma or the kind of strategic thinking that Rick brought to leadership. He survived through stubbornness, through an animal refusal to lie down that had been beaten into him long before the dead started walking. Daryl never wanted to lead anyone. He was a tracker, a hunter, a man most comfortable in the spaces between communities, moving through the woods with his crossbow and his silence. But people followed him anyway, because he was the person who would go back. When someone was lost, Daryl went looking. When someone was in danger, Daryl walked toward the threat. He had promised Judith, before leaving America, that he would find Rick and Michonne and bring them home. He ended up on the wrong side of an ocean, protecting a child he didn't know, fighting a war that wasn't his because walking away from someone who needed help was the one thing Daryl Dixon could not do. It was the thing his father had done to him, and Daryl had spent his entire life being the opposite of his father. Carol Pelletier's transformation was the most dramatic in the franchise's history, and it happened so gradually that you could almost miss it. The woman who flinched when her husband Ed raised his voice. The woman who wept over her daughter's empty bedroom at the farm. The woman who killed Karen and David in the prison and accepted exile without complaint because she understood, even if no one else did yet, that what she had done was necessary. The woman who walked into Terminus disguised as a walker, covered in mud and blood and the viscera of the dead, carrying a stolen rifle, and tore the place apart from the outside while her friends fought from within. By the time Carol reached France, she had killed more people than most survivors could count, and she carried every death with her, not as trophies, as debts. She told Ash, the pilot who flew her across the Atlantic, that she was looking for her daughter. Sophia had been dead for 13 years. Carol knew that, but the search for Sophia was never really about finding a body. It was about finding the part of herself that had died when her daughter walked out of Herschel's barn, the part that could love without reservation, without the armour of pragmatism and violence that she had built around her heart to survive. In the Channel Tunnel, in the hallucinogenic darkness, Carol found it. She saw Sophia, not the walker, the child, alive and warm and whole, standing in the blue-green glow of the bioluminescent fungus. And when the vision turned and walked away, Carol let her go. She smiled and she let her go. It was, in its quiet way, the bravest thing Carol Pelletier had ever done. Because letting go of grief requires more courage than holding on to it. And Carol had been holding on for so long that it had become the architecture of her identity. Michonne carried a katana and the memory of two jawless walkers on chains. The walkers had been her boyfriend and his friend, reanimated and mutilated and kept as camouflage to move safely among the dead. She had been alone for so long before finding Rick's group that the muscle of human connection had nearly atrophied. But it came back, slowly and then completely, the way love tends to when it finds fertile ground. She and Rick built something together in Alexandria that was more than survival. It was a life, a real life, with children and purpose and the kind of quiet domestic moments that the apocalypse was supposed to have made impossible. When Rick disappeared, Michonne refused to accept that he was dead. She searched, for years across miles through every dead end and false lead that the post-apocalyptic world could throw at her. She left her children in the care of people she trusted, a decision that cost her more than anyone else would ever know. Because the only thing harder than searching for someone you love is doing it while knowing that your other loved ones need you too. When she finally found Rick in a combat zone, wearing a CRM uniform, the moment of recognition was the kind of thing that the franchise had been building toward for years. She dropped her sword, he dropped his guard, and in a world where love was supposed to be a liability, where caring about anyone was an invitation for the universe to take them from you, they proved that the opposite was true. Love was the only thing that had brought either of them this far, and it was the thing that would take them home. Negan was the franchise's most complicated question, wrapped in a leather jacket and a barbed wire bat. He was the villain. That was never in dispute. What Glenn's death did to Maggie, to the group, to the audience watching, was an act of irredeemable cruelty, delivered with a showman's grin. But The Walking Dead had never been interested in simple villainy, and over the years that followed, the show peeled back the layers of the man behind the bat and found something unsettling. Not a monster, a person, a deeply flawed, deeply damaged person who had built an empire of fear because fear was the only tool he trusted, because the world before the outbreak had taught him that kindness was weakness, and weakness got you killed. Lucille the Bat was named for Lucille the woman, Negan's wife, who had died of cancer while Negan was having an affair. He wasn't there when she needed him. He wasn't there when she was scared and in pain and looking for the one person who had promised to love her through everything. That failure, that original sin, was the foundation on which every subsequent atrocity was built. Negan couldn't save his wife, so he built a world where he could save everyone, whether they wanted saving or not, through absolute control and absolute consequences for disobedience. The cell in Alexandria's basement was where the old Negan went to die. 7 years, no bat, no wives, no point system, no one calling him sir. Just a man in a room with the echoes of everything he had done. When he emerged, the world expected him to be the same. He wasn't. He wasn't redeemed exactly. Redemption is too clean a word for what Negan went through. He was weathered, worn down. The sharp edges were still there, but the swagger had calcified into something more like weariness. He saved Judith during a blizzard. He fought the Whisperers. He tried to build a quiet life with Annie and Joshua. And then the world pulled him back to Manhattan, and he found himself standing in front of a crowd of hostile gang leaders with Lucille in his hand, and the Dharma watching from the shadows, and the question that had followed him since Glenn's death still hanging in the air, unanswered. Was there anything left of the man underneath the monster? Ginny's death answered it. Not the way anyone would have wanted, not cleanly or triumphantly, but honestly. The man who sat on the floor of a cathedral and wept for a child he couldn't save was not the man who had laughed while swinging a bat at a kneeling prisoner. Something had changed, not enough to erase the past, nothing could do that, but enough to suggest that the future might hold something other than repetition. Glenn Rhee never got a future. That was the point, and it was the wound that the franchise never fully healed from. Glenn was a pizza delivery boy from Atlanta who survived the apocalypse by being fast and brave and fundamentally decent in a way that the world kept trying to beat out of him. He rescued Rick from a tank surrounded by walkers on his first day in the new world. He fell in love with Maggie Green in the middle of a zombie plague and married her in a prison yard. And they were going to have a baby. He was the heart of the group, the person who reminded everyone else that the point of surviving was to live, not just to not die. And Negan took him away in a clearing in the woods, and the sound of that bat connecting with his skull was the sound of something being broken in the franchise that could never be fully repaired. Maggie carried that sound with her to Manhattan. She carried it with her into every room where Negan was present. She carried it as she stood over him, with Lucille raised above her head, ready to bring it down, ready to close the circle. And she didn't swing. Not because she forgave him. Forgiveness might never come. But because she understood, in that moment, looking at the medical equipment scattered around a cell where a dead girl lay reanimated, that killing Negan wouldn't bring Glenn back. It wouldn't give Herschel a father. It would only add another death to a ledger that was already overflowing, and she was tired of contributing to it. She was tired of the world's insistence that loss could only be answered with more loss. These were the people who carried the weight, not because they were chosen, not because they were special, because they were there and they refused to leave, and sometimes that's all heroism amounts to. The willingness to stay when everything inside you is screaming to run. 13 years after the wildfire virus was declared a pandemic, the world looked nothing like what it had been, and nothing like what anyone had predicted it would become. The cities were still there, mostly, their buildings standing against the sky in various states of decay, wrapped in ivy and overrun by the slow, patient advance of nature, reclaiming what had been taken from it. Trees grew through the floors of shopping malls. Rivers ran clean where factories had once pumped waste into the water. Deer grazed in the overgrown yards of suburban homes, and hawks nested in the upper floors of office buildings, and the air, in places where there were no walkers to contaminate it with the smell of rot, was cleaner than it had been in a century. There was a beauty to it, a terrible, heartbreaking beauty that survivors noticed when they allowed themselves to notice anything beyond the immediate demands of staying alive. The world was healing, not for humanity's sake. The world didn't care about humanity. It was healing the way a body heals, after a parasite is removed, slowly, indifferently, with no regard for what was lost in the process. In Greenland, a woman named Hannah had articulated this idea with a clarity that Carol Pelletier found difficult to forget. Hannah had come to the Arctic to study glacier melt and been stranded by the outbreak at a remote research station. She had lived there for over a decade with her partner Hune, watching the world from a distance, observing the way the planet responded to the sudden absence of its dominant species. She didn't see the walkers as monsters. She called them Tupilag, after an Inuit myth, a flesh-eating beast conjured to destroy your enemy. But the myth had a twist. If the Tupilag couldn't find its target, it returned home and destroyed its creator instead. Humanity had created wildfire. In a laboratory in France, with the best intentions or the worst, the species had engineered the instrument of its own undoing. And now the Tupilag had come home. It was eating its way through the population that had made it, and the population was fighting back with walls and weapons, and the desperate, beautiful, futile inventions of people who refused to accept that they were an endangered species. General Beale's prediction hung over all of it like a cloud. 14 years, that was his estimate. 14 years before the combination of walker herds, disease, starvation, and the steadily declining human population would push the species past the point of recovery. The math was simple and merciless. Fewer living people meant fewer people to defend against the dead. Fewer defenders meant more deaths. More deaths meant more walkers. More walkers meant fewer living people. The spiral tightened with every turn, and at the bottom of it was extinction. But Beale's math didn't account for everything. It didn't account for Laurent, the boy born from a dead mother, who might carry immunity in his blood. It didn't account for the reformed CRM, its helicopters now carrying supplies and envoys instead of soldiers and gas bombs. Its resources turned outward for the first time, toward helping rather than hoarding. It didn't account for the Commonwealth under Ezekiel's leadership, trading with Alexandria and the Hilltop and the Civic Republic, rebuilding the networks of cooperation and mutual aid that the old world had called civilization. It didn't account for Rick and Michonne, standing in a field in Virginia, watching their children run toward them while CRM helicopters flew overhead on missions of mercy instead of murder. Beale's math didn't account for the variable that no equation can capture, the stubborn, irrational, statistically insignificant but historically decisive tendency of human beings to refuse to die when the numbers say they should, to build when the world says there's nothing left to build with, to love when every rational calculation says that love is a liability, to plant gardens in prison yards and sing in the mornings and keep a tiger as a pet and wear a crown made of scrap metal and call it a kingdom, because the alternative is to accept that the story's over, and human beings are constitutionally incapable of accepting that. The Walking Dead was never really about the dead. The dead were the setting, the weather, the constant grinding background pressure that forced the living to make choices they would never have faced in a world where the dead stayed dead. The franchise's true subject was always the living, always the question of what people become when the structures that define their behaviour are removed. When there are no laws, no consequences, no social contract, no expectation of a tomorrow that looks anything like today. What emerges from that vacuum? The answer, 13 years in, was everything. Tyrants and saints, cannibals and healers, cults that wore the skin of the dead, and communities that held democratic elections. People who murdered strangers for a can of beans, and people who walked into quarantine wards to brew tea for the dying. The full spectrum of human behaviour, compressed and intensified by the pressure of extinction, played out across a landscape of ruins and regrowth, and the endless, shuffling, moaning dead. The virus stripped away the veneer of civilization. What it revealed underneath was not what anyone expected, not pure goodness, not pure evil, something more complicated and more interesting than either. A species that was capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, often in the same person, often in the same hour. A species that could build the sanctuary and also build the kingdom. That could create the CRM's death camps and also create Herschel's quarantine ward. That could swing a bat wrapped in barbed wire and also retrieve a ventilator from a ruined hospital to save a child who wasn't even yours. The communities that survived were the ones that understood this, not the ones that tried to eliminate the darkness in human nature, because that was impossible, and not the ones that embraced the darkness, because that was unsustainable. The ones that survived were the ones that held both truths at the same time, that human beings are capable of terrible things, and also beautiful things, that the same hand that holds a weapon can plant a seed, that the measure of a community is not whether its members are good or bad, but whether the structures they build encourage the better angels or the worse ones. Alexandria survived because it kept rebuilding. Every time the walls fell, every time a new enemy appeared, every time the dead breached the fences or the living burned the crops, the people of Alexandria picked up the pieces and started again. Not because they were optimistic, not because they believed the world would get better, because the act of rebuilding was itself the point. It was the declaration that said we are still here, we are still human. We still believe that what we're building matters even if the universe seems determined to tear it down. Daryl was still in France, fighting a war that wasn't his, protecting a child who might hold the key to the future, or might just be a child, because Daryl had never needed a grand reason to help someone. Carol was at his side because 13 years of separation and an ocean between them couldn't change the fact that they were family in the only way that mattered in this world. They had chosen each other. Rick was home, scarred and grey and missing a hand, holding his children for the first time in years, learning to be a father again in a world that had tried its best to make fatherhood irrelevant. And the walkers walked. They would always walk. That was the one certainty in a world where certainty had been the first casualty. The dead would continue to rise, and the living would continue to fight them, and the cycle would continue until one side ran out of bodies or the other found a way to break the loop. Laurent's immunity, if it was real, might be that break. The reformed CRM's resources might be that break. The slow, patient accumulation of cooperation between communities, the rebuilding of trust between people who had every reason to distrust each other, might be that break, or it might not be enough. That was the other possibility, the one that sat quietly in the corner of every hopeful conversation. Maybe Beale was right. Maybe 14 years was generous. Maybe the species had already passed the point of no return, and everything that the survivors were building, the walls and the farms and the trade routes and the alliances, was just a more elaborate version of rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. But they built anyway. They always built anyway, because the alternative was to sit in the ruins and wait for the end. And the kind of people who survived 13 years of The Walking Dead were not the kind of people who sat and waited for anything. The world didn't end with a bang. It was taken quietly, one person at a time, by a virus that had no malice and no purpose and no awareness of the suffering it caused, by a pathogen that was, in the end, just a piece of genetic code doing what genetic code does, replicating, surviving, spreading. The simplest, most ancient impulse in the biological universe, carried out on a scale that happened to destroy a civilization. And in the ruins of that civilization, in the silence of the abandoned cities and the overgrown highways, and the crumbling monuments to a species that once believed it was the apex of creation, something persisted. Not just the dead, though the dead persisted too, shuffling through the streets and the fields and the forests with a patience that would outlast everything. Something else, something quieter, something that the virus, for all its terrible elegance, could not touch. the insistence of life itself, the irrational, beautiful, stubborn insistence of the living to keep living, to keep building, to keep loving, even when love was the most dangerous thing you could carry, to keep planting seeds in the ashes and singing in the mornings and telling stories to children about the world that was and the world that might be. The walkers would walk until the last one crumbled to dust. The virus would wait inside every living body until the last heartbeat stopped. The world would continue to heal around the ruins, indifferent to the drama playing out among the creatures that had once claimed ownership of it. But somewhere, behind a wall that had been rebuilt for the 15th time, in a garden planted in soil that had been watered with blood and tears and the stubborn refusal to give up, someone was teaching a child to read. Someone was sharing a meal with a stranger. Someone was standing watch through the night so that someone else could sleep without fear. That was the law of the walking dead. Not the virus, not the walkers, not the wars or the factions or the monsters in human skin. The law was this, that even at the end of all things, even when the dead outnumbered the living and the darkness seemed total and permanent, there were people who lit candles, and the candles held. And if you listen closely in the silence between the moans of the dead and the wind through the empty streets, you can almost hear it, the sound of someone somewhere refusing to stop,